The bullet had already left the chamber before Amos Boone realized his hand was shaking. Not from fear. Not from whiskey, though Lord knew he had poured enough of that down his throat in the past 3 years to drown a lesser man. His hand was shaking because the tremor had come back, that deep, nerve-deep quiver that started somewhere between his shoulder blade and his spine and worked its way down his right arm like a rattlesnake uncoiling in winter, slow and cold and inevitable. The shot went wide. The bottle he had been aiming at, set on a fence post 40 yards out, sat there unbroken and mocking in the dying Arizona sunlight. The man behind him laughed. Amos did not turn around. He stood at the edge of the dry creek bed behind the livery stable in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, in the year of our Lord 1878, and he stared at that unbroken bottle like it had personally wronged him. Which, in a manner of speaking, it had. "That is the 4th shot in a row, Boone," said the voice behind him. The voice belonged to Cole Rudder, and Cole Rudder was the kind of man who laughed at other men's failures as a form of nutrition. He kept himself alive on the suffering of others. Word around town is you are supposed to be the fastest gun in the New Mexico and Arizona territories combined. Word around town appears to be pure fiction. "Walk away, Rudder," Amos said. His voice came out steady at least. Whatever the tremor was doing to his hand, it had not reached his voice yet. That was something. "Cannot walk away from a business proposition," Rudder said, and now his voice had shifted into something darker, something with teeth behind it. He stepped up beside Amos, close enough that Amos could smell the cheap tobacco and cheaper ambition coming off him in waves. Rudder was a hiring agent for the Barlow Cattle Syndicate, which was the polite name people used when they meant the operation that had been bleeding this territory dry for the better part of a decade. The Syndicate wants the Dawson woman off her land. Simple as that. You ride out there, you put the fear of God into her, she signs over the deed, and you collect $200 in silver coin. You do not even need to fire a shot. Amos turned to look at him then, and whatever Rudder saw in his face made the man take a small step backward, which was the only satisfaction available at the moment. "I am not a land bully," Amos said. "Find someone else." "We have tried someone else," Rudder said, recovering his composure with the practiced ease of a man who had survived many uncomfortable conversations. "3 men rode out to the Dawson place last month. You want to know what happened to them?" Amos waited. "One of them came back on his own horse, 2 of them came back tied across their saddles, and all 3 of them had been patched up so thoroughly they looked like something a schoolteacher might sew in a needlework class." Rudder shook his head with something that might have been genuine bewilderment if you were not paying attention. "That woman out there, she is not right. She is something else entirely. We need someone she cannot put down in the dirt." Amos looked back at the unbroken bottle on the fence post. His right hand hung at his side, and he could feel the tremor moving through it, subtle but relentless, like a river that had decided to run underground. He was already thinking about Lucy Dawson. He had heard the name. Everybody in Redemption Creek had heard the name, though half of them said it with respect, and the other half said it with something that was either fear or suspicion, and sometimes was both at once. The woman who ran the medical practice out of a converted homestead 12 miles north of town. The woman who had trained somewhere back east, at a time when women were not supposed to train anywhere at all for anything that mattered. The woman who had come out to Arizona Territory alone, with a wagon full of medical supplies and a deed to land that the Barlow Syndicate very much wanted to own, and who had proceeded to dig herself in like a mesquite tree in rocky soil, deep and stubborn, and apparently impossible to remove. The woman who had apparently unhorsed, patched up, and sent home 3 of the Syndicate's hired men. Amos Boone had a problem with his hand. The tremor had started 8 months ago, after a job in New Mexico had gone sideways in a way that had left 3 men dead, and Amos's right arm pinned under a collapsed barn wall for 6 hours. The doctor in Santa Fe had told him it might be nerve damage. The doctor in Tucson had told him it was permanent. The doctor in Yuma had told him to find a new profession. Amos had told all three of them where they could put their opinions and had continued practicing his draw in the mornings, but the bottle on the fence post was not lying to him. His aim was deteriorating. His hand was unreliable. His future as a man who survived by being the fastest and most accurate gun in any given situation was contracting with every passing week. He needed a solution. He told himself that was the only reason he turned to Rudder and said, "I am not going out there to frighten her, but I will ride out and have a conversation." Rudder smiled with his mouth. His eyes stayed calculating. "That is all we are asking." It was not all they were asking, and both men knew it. But Amos Boone swung himself up onto his roan horse, whose name was General, and who had more common sense than any man Amos had ridden with in the past decade, and he pointed General's nose north, toward the Dawson land, and he tried very hard not to think about the fact that his right hand, resting on his thigh as he rode, would not stop trembling. The road north out of Redemption Creek wound through scrub desert that had a stark, uncompromising beauty to it, all red rock and sage, and the skeletal arms of Ocotillo reaching up against a sky so blue it looked painted. Amos had been in this territory long enough to appreciate it, even if the appreciation came mostly in the form of a grudging acknowledgement that the land did not particularly care whether you lived or died, which was a quality he could respect. 1878 was shaping up to be a hard year. The summer had been brutal, the water sources were dropping, and the Barlow Syndicate had been steadily acquiring land throughout the territory with a combination of legal maneuvering, financial pressure, and the kind of naked intimidation that required men like Amos Boone to exist and be available for hire. He had been available for hire for 9 years. Since 1869, when he had come back from the war with a talent for accuracy and a complete inability to settle into anything that required him to stay in one place for longer than a season. He was 31 years old, which was not old, but in his profession, it was old enough to feel the weight of the years pulling at him like gravity had become personally interested in his case. He had worked as a marshal's deputy in Texas, as a cattle drive guard in Colorado, as a bounty hunter in New Mexico, and as the kind of generalized problem solver whose services the powerful purchased when they needed something done and did not want to be seen doing it themselves. He was not proud of everything he had done, but he was alive, which was more than could be said for a significant number of men who had stood across from him. The Dawson homestead came into view about an hour before sunset, and Amos pulled General to a stop at the top of a low rise to look at it before riding in. He had learned a long time ago that looking before you entered anywhere was a survival strategy worth more than any number of fast draws. What he saw surprised him. He had expected something modest, maybe defiant in that particular way that single women's properties tended to be defiant, which was to say barely hanging on but refusing to admit it. What he saw instead was a property that was not merely surviving but genuinely functioning. The main structure was a long adobe building that had been expanded thoughtfully, with a covered porch running along the full front length and a separate smaller structure to the east that had a chimney and a window with genuine glass in it. There was a kitchen garden that was still producing this late in the season, neatly organized, with irrigation channels that someone had thought through carefully. There was a corral with 3 horses in it, good horses by the look of them, well fed and calm. There were chickens. There was a rain catchment system connected to barrels along the north wall that showed someone had given serious thought to the problem of water in a desert. And there was a woman in the corral, doing something with one of the horses that stopped Amos cold even from a quarter mile away. He watched for a long moment, then clicked his tongue and urged General forward at a walk, giving the property plenty of time to see him coming. The last thing he needed was to be mistaken for a threat and shot from a distance, which, given what he had heard about the Dawson woman, was not an impossible outcome. As he got closer, he could see what she was doing with the horse. The animal, a gray mare with the wide eyes of a horse that had been badly frightened at some point in its life, was pressing itself against the far rail of the corral, trembling. The woman was not approaching it directly. She was standing in the center of the corral, completely still, her body turned slightly sideways to the mare, her hands loose at her sides. She was talking to it, low and steady, and she was not moving. Just standing there like she had all the time in the world, while the horse watched her with those wide, rolling eyes and tried to decide whether or not to trust. Amos reined General in at the corral fence and watched without speaking, because something about the scene made speech feel like exactly the wrong thing. After what might have been 3 minutes or might have been 10, the gray mare took one step toward the woman. Then another. Then she dropped her head, blew out a long breath through her nose, and walked the rest of the way across the corral to stand beside the woman, who lifted one hand slowly and laid it against the horse's neck. The woman turned around then and looked directly at Amos, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of having been caught watching something private. Lucy Dawson was 26 years old, though he did not know that yet. She was tall for a woman of the time, lean in the way of people who worked hard and ate practically, with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical knot that had shed enough pins over the course of the day that several pieces of it had escaped around her face. She had a quality of watchfulness about her that Amos recognized, because he had cultivated the same quality in himself over years of professional survival. Her eyes, which were the deep gray-green of river water over limestone, moved over him with the focused, assessing attention of someone who was accustomed to reading physical details quickly and accurately. She was wearing canvas trousers and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, which in 1878 was the kind of detail that people in town talked about. Amos suspected she knew they talked about it and had decided it was not her problem. "You are Amos Boone," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "You are Lucy Dawson." "I am," she agreed, in the same tone he had used, which he realized was her matching him exactly and making a small, dry point about it. "You want to get down and state your business, or are you planning to sit up there on that horse for the entire conversation?" He swung down from General, looping the reins over the fence rail. Up close, he could see that she was holding something in her left hand, a folded cloth that had the brownish stain of dried herbs on it, and that her hands were steady in a way that he noticed because his own were not. "I am going to be straightforward with you," he said, because something about her made it feel like the only viable strategy. "Good," she said. "I have had enough of men who are not. Cole Rudder hired me to come out here and put pressure on you to sell your land to the Barlow Syndicate." She looked at him for a moment. The gray mare stood behind her with its nose near her shoulder, having apparently decided that the man by the fence was not an immediate threat. "And are you going to do that?" Lucy asked. "I have not decided yet," he said, which was honest in a way that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something like recalibration, as if he had said something that did not fit the category she had been preparing to place him in, and she was now creating a new category on the spot. "Well," she said, "as long as you are here, you might as well come in and tell me what they are planning. Because whatever they are planning, it involves my land, and I have a right to know." She turned and walked toward the main house without waiting to see if he would follow, which he did, because there was no other reasonable response to that particular invitation from that particular woman. The inside of the house was, like the outside, a surprise. The front room had been converted into something between a sitting room and a consultation area, with a long wooden table against one wall that held rows of labeled glass bottles and ceramic jars, and a second table in the center of the room that was clearly used for examining patients. There were shelves of books along the far wall, more books than Amos had seen outside of a proper town library, and they were not decorative books. They were used books, with broken spines and pages that had been turned many times by someone who had actually read them. He could make out the titles of several: Gray's Anatomy, The Principles of Surgery, Practical Medicine by Flint, and several volumes in what he thought might be German or possibly Latin. "Sit," Lucy Dawson said, gesturing toward a pair of chairs near the front window. She poured water from a clay pitcher into 2 tin cups and put one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He sat. He drank the water, which was cold and clean and tasted faintly of mint, and he told her what Rudder had told him. All of it, including the part about the 3 men who had been sent before him. When he was done, she sat quietly for a moment, her fingers loosely wrapped around her own cup. "They will not stop," she said. The words were stated without drama, factually, in the tone of a scientist describing a physical law. "The Syndicate wants this land because it sits over the best remaining aquifer in this part of the territory. They have known about it for 2 years. The previous attempts to force me out have been, shall we say, instructive in terms of what they are willing to do. They will escalate." "Yes," Amos agreed. "Which brings me to you," she said, and those gray-green eyes came up and fixed on him with the same focused attention she had given the frightened horse in the corral. "You are a gunfighter. You have a reputation that I have heard about in sufficiently unflattering detail to know it is real. You are not a man who typically turns down a paying job on philosophical grounds. So why are you sitting in my kitchen telling me what Rudder hired you to do instead of doing it?" Amos looked at his right hand on the table. He turned it palm up, and after a moment, the tremor that he had been suppressing through the force of will came back, and his fingers shook slightly against the tabletop. The silence stretched between them. Lucy Dawson leaned forward, and before he could react, she had taken his right hand in both of hers and was examining it with a focused, clinical attention that somehow managed to be neither invasive nor impersonal, but was instead purely purposeful. She turned his hand over, pressed along the underside of his forearm, bent and straightened his fingers one at a time, and then placed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist in a way that told him she was feeling his pulse. "How long?" she asked. 8 months, he said. "Barn Wall, New Mexico." "Which side of the arm took the primary compression?" He blinked. "The underside." "The radial side, if that means anything." She looked at him. "It means everything," she said. "The men who have looked at this before, the ones in Santa Fe and Tucson and wherever else you have been, what did they tell you?" He was not sure how she knew there had been others, and then he realized she had simply inferred it from the fact that a man who relied on his shooting hand would have sought multiple opinions. "They told me it was nerve damage, permanent. I should retire." "They were half right," she said. She had released his hand, but he could still feel the exact places where her fingers had pressed, as if she had left small, warm impressions in his skin. "The nerve was damaged, yes. But permanent is a word doctors use when they do not want to invest the time to find out if they are wrong." She stood up and went to the shelf of bottles along the wall, scanning them with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly what she had and where she kept it. "There is a treatment protocol that I have been developing, partly from the literature and partly from my own observations working with injury cases out here. It involves specific exercises to rebuild the nerve pathways, combined with certain plant-derived compounds that reduce the inflammatory response that is almost certainly still compressing the nerve. It will take time, 3 months, possibly 4. You would need to be here, or nearby." She turned back to him with a small bottle in one hand and looked at him with an expression that was direct and entirely without artifice. "I am telling you this not because I want something from you, although I suspect we may be able to come to an arrangement that benefits both of us. I am telling you because I can help you, and I believe in helping people when I can, and because your body is telling me that it wants to heal whether or not you have had the good sense to find someone capable of facilitating that." Amos Boone, who had been spoken to by many people in his 31 years in many tones and registers, sat very still and felt something move in his chest that he could not immediately identify because it had been absent long enough that he had begun to assume it was simply not a thing that happened to him anymore. "What kind of arrangement?" he asked. "The Syndicate will send more men," she said, sitting back down across from him. and I can stitch them up all day long, and I will, because I am a healer, and I do not let people bleed in my front yard regardless of their moral failings. But stitching up the men they send does not solve the underlying problem, which is that they want my land and they are not going to stop wanting it until someone costs them too much in time and money and embarrassment for it to be worth their continued interest. She paused. I need someone who can be here, who can be visible, who carries the kind of reputation that makes the men Rudder would normally hire think twice about accepting the job. You want me as a deterrent, he said. I want you as a deterrent, she agreed. And in exchange, I will treat your hand. I will be honest with you about my chances of success, which I believe are good but are not guaranteed. And I will pay you what I can, which is not $200 in silver but is room, board, meals, and something I suspect you have not had in a long time. What is that? He asked. The honest opinion of someone who is not afraid of you, she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. He stayed. He had not planned to stay, had certainly not planned to stable General in her corral next to the 3 good horses, and carry his saddlebags into the small room off the main building that she told him had been used as storage and was now, apparently, his. But he stayed, and when she knocked on his door the next morning at first light with a tin of something that smelled sharp and medicinal, and told him to rub it into his right forearm while she described the specific motion he needed to use, he did that too. The arrangement was strange, and it was not comfortable, and it suited him more than anything had suited him in years. Redemption Creek was a town of 900 people in 1878, which meant it was not small but it was not large, and news of Amos Boone's presence at the Dawson place spread through it within 24 hours of his arrival with the speed and thoroughness of a grass fire in a dry wind. He rode into town 3 days after arriving, partly for supplies and partly because being seen was, as Lucy had correctly identified, a significant portion of his value to her current situation. The reaction was exactly what he had expected and what she had calculated. Men who had been planning to ride north suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Cole Rudder sent him a message through the bartender at the Silver Spur Saloon that said, in essence, that the Syndicate's offer still stood, and that Amos should reconsider his current arrangement before it cost him more than it was worth. Amos sent back a message that the bartender, to his credit, delivered word for word, that he was not currently available for new employment. What he had not expected was the town itself. Redemption Creek in 1878 was a place in the process of becoming something. It had the saloon, the general store, a small school, a church that served also as a meeting hall, a blacksmith, and the kind of informal social organization that developed in frontier communities where people had to rely on each other for survival whether or not they particularly liked each other. It also had Dr. Whitmore, who was 72 years old and had been the town's physician for 15 years, and who had, over the course of those 15 years, drunk himself from adequacy to something considerably below it. Several people in town, including the schoolteacher and the Reverend's wife, came to Lucy Dawson instead. They made the 12-mile trip north by wagon or on horseback, or she made the trip to them when the need was urgent, and she had been doing this for 2 years without anyone from the formal power structure of the town acknowledging it, because a woman practicing medicine in 1878 was something that people were generally willing to quietly accept when they had no alternative and publicly deny when asked directly. Amos, riding back from town on his second supply run, was passed by a wagon going north, driven by a man whose wife was lying in the back of it breathing in a way that Amos did not like at all, and he turned General around and rode alongside to make sure they made it to Lucy's without stopping. He watched her work that evening from the doorway of the main room, and what he saw settled something in him that had been unsettled for years. She worked with a precision and an economy of motion that reminded him of the best marksman he had ever seen, except that Where their precision was directed at ending things, hers was directed at the opposite. Her hands, which were steady in a way that he envied with a depth that surprised him, moved through the process of examination and treatment with a confidence that was not arrogance but was something quieter and more solid, the confidence of a person who had done the work, had learned the material, had practiced until practice became mastery, and who no longer needed to perform confidence because they had the genuine article. The woman in the wagon had a serious lung infection. Lucy explained it to the husband quietly and clearly, used a word, pneumonia, that Amos had heard before in connection with death, and then proceeded to tell the man exactly what she was going to do and why, and then to do it, over the course of 4 hours during which Amos quietly brought water and wood, and generally made himself useful in the background, while Lucy Dawson demonstrated exactly why people made a 12-mile trip to her door. The woman's breathing had improved noticeably by midnight. Lucy sent the husband to sleep in the storage room, installed herself in the chair beside the patient's bed, and told Amos, who was lingering in the doorway with no good reason to still be there, to go to sleep. "You have been standing in that doorway for 4 hours, she said, without looking up from the patient. "I might have been needed," he said. "You brought water and you kept the fire going and you were a perfectly adequate presence," she said. "Now you are something I need to put away, because I need to focus, and you standing in that doorway looking at me is making that harder than it should be." He was already halfway down the hall when he realized what she had said, or more accurately, what she had implied. He stood in the dark hallway for a moment, processing this information, and then he went to his room and spent a considerable amount of time lying on his back on the narrow cot, staring at the adobe ceiling and thinking thoughts that he had not been permitting himself to think. The treatment she had prescribed for his hand required him to spend 30 minutes every morning doing specific exercises with his fingers and hand while she watched, monitored his progress, and made adjustments to the protocol. This meant that every morning, before the day began, they sat together at the kitchen table in the early light, and she held his hand and moved it in ways she was teaching him to do himself, and they talked. They talked about everything except the things they were not yet ready to talk about. She told him about her training, which had been at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, one of the few institutions that would accept women into full medical programs at the time. She had graduated in 1874, had done a period of supervised practice in Philadelphia, and had come west in 1876 when her father, who had owned the land, had died and left it to her along with the conviction, which she had inherited intact from him, that the frontier was where the work was. He told her about the war, selectively. He told her about the years after, more honestly than he had told anyone in a long time. He told her about the barn in New Mexico and the 6 hours under the collapsed wall, which he had not told anyone before, not in its entirety, because it required admitting not just the physical damage but the particular quality of terror that those hours had contained, and that was not something he had previously been willing to do. She listened to all of it without offering false comfort, which he found he valued more than the false comfort would have been worth. She asked specific questions. She noted the things he said about the weight and the cold, and the particular way the pain had moved through his arm, and he could see her integrating the information into her understanding of his injury, building a clearer picture of exactly what had happened and what might be done about it. "You are afraid," she said one morning about 3 weeks in the middle of his exercises. "I am familiar with fear," he said carefully. "No," she said. "You are afraid specifically that the hand will not come back. And underneath that, you are afraid of who you are if it does not, because your identity has been built on this capacity for so long that you cannot clearly see what is left without it." She was watching his fingers as she spoke, adjusting the angle of his wrist with unhurried authority. "I am not saying this as a criticism. I am saying it because until you can separate the fear from the injury, your body will respond to the fear as a threat, and the threat response will increase the inflammation, and the increased inflammation will slow the healing." He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know that?" he asked. There is a body of work coming out of European medical research, particularly from German and French practitioners, that suggests the nervous system and the emotional state are not as separate as Western medicine has traditionally assumed, she said. She was entirely serious, and there was nothing in her expression that suggested she was concerned about whether he found this credible or not. She had clearly moved past the point of needing her ideas to be validated by the person she was speaking to. I have seen it in practice consistently enough to be confident in the connection. The mind and the body are in constant conversation, and both need to be treated. Amos Boone, who had spent his entire adult life building walls between what his mind experienced and what his body did, sat with this for several days. Then the second wave from the Syndicate arrived. It was a Sunday morning, 3.5 weeks after Amos had come to the Dawson place, and it arrived in the form of 4 riders who came in from the south in the early morning, while the light was still thin and pink and the shadows long. Amos saw them from the corral, where he had gone to check on General's water, and he watched them coming with the particular quality of attention that had kept him alive for 9 years. 4 men. 3 of them he did not know. The 4th was a man named Shelby Cross, who had been a hired gun in Texas and Colorado before apparently entering the employment of the Barlow Syndicate, and who was, by reliable account, very good with a pistol and not particularly burdened by moral considerations. Amos walked to the front of the house and stood on the porch, and he waited for them to arrive. They pulled up their horses at the fence line, which was good judgment, and Shelby Cross looked at Amos from under the brim of his hat with the measuring expression of one professional assessing another. "Boone," he said. "Cross," Amos said. "You are off your usual territory." "Work is work," Cross said. His eyes moved from Amos to the house and back. "You know why we are here." "I expect I do," Amos said. "And you know I am going to tell you to leave." The 3 men behind Cross shifted in their saddles with the restless energy of men waiting for permission to do something. Cross was still watching Amos with that assessing look. His eyes had dropped briefly and involuntarily to Amos's right hand, and Amos knew that Cross had heard about the tremor. Information traveled in their line of work. It was part of the calculation Cross was making right now. The door of the house opened behind him, and Lucy Dawson came out onto the porch, and Amos did not need to turn around to know she was there. He could feel her presence the way you feel a solid wall at your back, not as a limitation but as a support. "Miss Dawson," Cross called out, "the Syndicate has revised its offer upward. They are willing to pay you fair market value for this land, plus an additional relocation allowance. That is a generous offer, and you know it." "The offer was not generous 3 weeks ago, and it is not generous now," Lucy said from behind Amos's shoulder. Her voice was absolutely level, the way a surgeon's hands are level, by training and by will. "The Syndicate wants this land because the aquifer under it serves approximately 250 families in this and 2 neighboring territories. Selling it to a private corporation would give that corporation control of the primary water supply for a significant portion of the Arizona territory, which is a circumstance I am not willing to create. That is my position, and it is not going to change regardless of the number you put on the offer." Cross looked at her for a long moment. Amos watched Cross's hands. "That is a lot of high-minded principle for a woman standing out here alone," Cross said. "She is not alone," Amos said, and his voice came out in the particular flat, unhurried register that professional men in their trade recognized as the final position before action. Cross looked at him again. The assessment was still going on behind his eyes. Amos could see it, the calculation of angles and probabilities, and whether the tremor that Cross had heard about was real, and if it was real, how much it mattered. It was the same calculation Amos had been making about himself for 8 months, and he was tired of it. "We will be back," Cross said. "I expect you will," Amos said. They turned their horses and rode south, and Amos watched them until they were out of sight before he let out a long breath and turned around to find Lucy Dawson watching him with an expression that had something new in it. "You held your ground," she said. "That is what you hired me for," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you also held your hand very still." He looked down at his right hand. She was right. During the entire confrontation, with the fear and the adrenaline and the professional assessment of Cross and his three companions going through him like a current, his hand had been still. Not perfectly still, perhaps, but still enough. Still enough that Cross had looked at it and had made the choice, however temporarily, not to push. "Your exercises are working," Lucy said simply, and went back inside. He stood on the porch for another moment, looking at his hand, and felt something complicated and fragile and very important begin to take shape in the vicinity of his chest. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch in the cooling air, and she asked him about his life before the war. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had run a small farm and a mother who had been the kind of woman who ran everything else, about a childhood that had been hard in the ordinary way of hard childhoods in that time and place, not dramatic, just shaped by work and weather, and the particular silence of men who did not discuss what they felt. "Did your mother talk to you?" Lucy asked. "She talked to everyone," he said. "She was the kind of woman who thought that words were the primary tool for fixing problems." Was she right? He thought about it seriously, which was something he was finding himself doing more often around her, taking questions seriously instead of deflecting them. "About some problems," he said. "Not about the ones that required a fence to be mended or a crop to come in." "She sounds like she would have been an interesting person to know," Lucy said. "She died when I was 12, he said. "Fever." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said, and it was said in the way she did most things, without excess or performance, but with a quality of genuine weight behind it that made it mean more than the words alone. "What about your father?" he asked. "You said he left you this land." "He was a surveyor," she said. "He spent 30 years mapping territory that nobody had mapped before, which meant he spent 30 years knowing where the water was and understanding what that meant." She paused. "He believed that knowledge was not just personal property. He used to say that information about the land belongs to the land and to the people who live on it, not to whoever happens to have the capital to file the right papers at the right moment." She looked out at the desert, which was turning the deep purple of late evening, the Ocotillo silhouetted against a sky full of stars coming in. "I believe that too, which is why I am not going to sell." "They will not give up," he said. "Rudder and Cross and the Syndicate, they will keep sending men." "I know," she said, "which is why I am going to write some letters." He looked at her. "Letters?" "I have been documenting the Syndicate's activities for the past 2 years," she said. "Land acquisition records, testimony from families who have been displaced, the names and circumstances of men who have been hired to intimidate landowners throughout the territory. I have been waiting until I had enough to be useful, because a partial case is worse than no case. I believe I now have enough." She turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the porch her eyes were serious and certain. "I am writing to the territorial governor's office and to the federal land commissioner, and to a journalist in Phoenix who has been covering syndicate activities for 18 months. If I time the letters correctly, the story will break simultaneously in enough places that the syndicate cannot suppress it through their usual methods, which include, in case you were wondering, bribing editors and threatening reporters." Amos looked at her for a long time. "You have been working toward this for 2 years, he said. "Yes," she said, "since before I arrived." "Significantly before you arrived," she agreed. "You are, if I am being direct about it, an accelerant. Your presence here has bought me the time to finish the documentation without being driven off the land while I was doing it, but the strategy was mine and it was already in motion." He felt, again, that thing in his chest. It was getting harder to pretend he did not know what it was. "You are remarkable," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him. "You say that as if it is unusual," she said. as if the capacity for this kind of thinking is somehow notable in a woman. I understand why you say it, given the world we are living in, but I want you to know that I do not find it unusual in myself, because I have been doing it my entire life, and I long ago stopped being surprised by my own capabilities. What I find unusual is meeting a man who, when confronted with evidence of those capabilities, does not immediately attempt to undermine them. I am not going to undermine them, Amos said. I would not know how, and I would not want to if I did. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Good. Then we understand each other," and turned back to the stars. And they sat in a silence that was comfortable in a way that silences between two people are only comfortable when there is already something substantial between them that does not require words to keep it alive. 2 days later, Amos rode into Redemption Creek and came back to find that Lucy had had 3 patients in his absence, including a child with a badly broken arm that she had set and splinted with a precision that the child's father, who was a carpenter and understood the geometry of structures, described to Amos with something approaching awe. She was cleaning instruments at the table when he came in, and she told him about the cases with the brisk efficiency of a physician giving a report, and he listened with an attention that had nothing to do with medical procedure and everything to do with the fact that watching her be exactly who she was had become the most engaging thing in his daily experience. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, when she had finished. She put down the instrument she was cleaning and looked at him. "All right," she said. "I took this job from Rutter," he said. "I told you that from the start, but I want to be clear about something I was not entirely clear about at the beginning. I came here with the intention of having a conversation, not of actually doing what Rutter wanted, but I was not then, as I am now, completely certain where my loyalties were. I want you to know that they are now completely certain." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was no version of this conversation that was not, at its core, about trust, and they both knew it. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because the letters you are sending are going to provoke a serious response from the Syndicate," he said, "and I want you to know before that happens exactly where I stand." "Where do you stand?" she asked. "With you," he said, "entirely and without reservation." Something moved across her face that was not her professional composure. It was something warmer and more vulnerable, and he could see her choosing to let him see it rather than managing it back to neutral, which was itself an act of trust so clear and deliberate that it felt like being handed something precious by someone who could not easily afford to give it away. "Then we stand together," she said. The response from the Syndicate came faster than either of them had expected. It came not through Cross or Rutter, but through a legal instrument, served by a man in a suit who arrived at the Dawson place on a Thursday morning with 2 witnesses, and a document that claimed to demonstrate that the original deed to Lucy's land had been filed improperly and was therefore void, and that the Barlow Syndicate, which had filed a counterclaim, was the legal owner of the property. Lucy read the document with the same focused attention she gave everything, standing on the porch with the morning sun behind her and Amos at her shoulder, and when she finished reading it she said, without raising her voice, "This document contains 3 factual inaccuracies and 1 outright forgery." The man in the suit blinked. "I beg your pardon. The survey date cited in paragraph 3 is incorrect by 14 months, Lucy said. "The witness signature on the counterclaim is identical to a signature on a deed recorded in Maricopa County in 1873, which is impossible because the man whose name it bears died in 1871. And the Land Commissioner's seal on page 4 is printed at the wrong angle for a genuine document from that office, because I have seen genuine documents from that office, and the seal is always centered on the line, not rotated 3 degrees clockwise." The silence that followed was absolute except for the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. The man in the suit looked at Lucy Dawson with an expression that moved through several stages of emotion in rapid succession: disbelief, recalculation, the dawning of professional concern, and then something that was just barely not panic. That is, the documents were provided to me by the Syndicate's legal representation, and I was not informed of any irregularities. I know that, Lucy said, and her voice was not unkind. I am not accusing you of knowing. I am telling you what I know, which is that this document is fraudulent, and that it would be in your professional interest to verify that independently before you file it with any territorial court. Because if you file a document you have been told is fraudulent, and it is subsequently proven to be fraudulent, the legal and professional consequences for you personally would be considerable. She handed the document back to him. He took it with the careful hands of a man handling something that had recently become much more complicated than it had been when he picked it up this morning. I will, of course, verify, he said. His voice had lost most of its official certainty. Of course, Lucy said pleasantly. The man and his witnesses departed. Amos watched them go, and then turned to look at Lucy Dawson with an expression on his face that he could not entirely control. The seal angle, he said. I noticed it immediately, she said. But the witness signature was the real tell. A man who died in 1871 cannot sign a document in 1878. The Syndicate's legal department apparently did not do thorough enough research on their own forged witnesses. How did you know about the man dying in 1871? Amos asked. Because his son is one of my patients, she said. He told me about his father's death during a consultation 18 months ago, and I remembered it because he was describing the specific symptoms of the illness, which were consistent with a type of fever that I had been seeing in cases from the eastern part of the territory. She paused. I do not forget things that patients tell me. It seems like the least I can do in exchange for their trusting me with their health. Amos Boone had been shocked in his life. He had been shocked by gunfire coming from directions he had not anticipated, and by men he had trusted who had turned out to be something other than what they seemed, and by the particular shock of surviving situations where he should not have survived. But he had never, not once in his 31 years, been shocked by a woman in the way that Lucy Dawson had just shocked him, which was not the shock of surprise but the shock of genuine, unambiguous admiration, the kind that moves through you like a physical force and rearranges something in its wake. He was not entirely sure his face was doing what he wanted it to do. You see everything, he said. It was not a complete sentence and it was not a complete thought, but it was accurate. I try to, she said, and she was looking at him with those gray-green eyes, and there was something in her expression that told him she was seeing quite a lot right now. Lucy, he said and stopped. Amos, she said in the same tone, which told him she was as aware of the current moment as he was and was giving him time to navigate it at whatever pace he needed. I do not know how to do this, he said. In general, that is. I have spent a long time being a very particular kind of man in a very particular kind of situation, and what I am feeling right now does not fit that category, and I am not sure what to do with it. That is the most honest thing I have heard you say, she said. It is the most vulnerable thing I have said to another person in approximately 15 years, he said. Then it was overdue, she said, and the corner of her mouth had moved again in that way that he had been watching for since the first day, and this time it went further, and he saw her smile properly for the first time, and it was the kind of smile that a person who spent most of their time being serious offers only when something genuinely compels it, which made it worth more than 100 easy smiles from 100 different people. He did not touch her. It was not the moment for that, and he knew it, and more importantly she would know if he got the moment wrong, because she noticed everything. But he held her gaze and he let her see what was in his, and the smile he gave her was slower and less certain than hers but was, he thought, just as genuine. The letters she had written went out the following week. She had spent 3 evenings composing them, and she had shown him the final drafts, not for approval but because she wanted him to understand exactly what was coming and what form it was likely to take. The letters were extraordinary documents, precise and factual, and organized with the same systematic care she brought to everything, marshaling 2 years' worth of documented evidence into a case that was not an accusation so much as an inevitability. Reading them, Amos had the same feeling he had watching her work with injured patients, the feeling of watching mastery in motion. The Syndicate did not know the letters had gone out. This was deliberate. Lucy had sent them through 3 different couriers departing on 3 different days through 3 different towns, which meant that by the time the story began to appear in the Phoenix paper and the Territorial Record and the Office of the Land Commissioner, it was too late for the Syndicate to suppress it at the source. But before that happened, Cole Rudder made his final move. He came himself, which was unusual, and which told Amos that the situation had elevated to a point where Rudder no longer trusted it to subordinates. He came with Cross and 6 other men, 8 in total, on a Saturday afternoon when the light was sharp and hot and the dust they raised coming in from the south was visible from a mile away. Amos saw them coming and walked to the house. 8 men, he said. Rudder is with them. Cross too. Lucy looked up from the document she was annotating. She was calm in the way that he had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but was the thing she had built over years to contain and direct it. "All right," she said. She stood up, straightened her shirt, and walked to the cabinet on the far wall where she kept, among other things, the Winchester rifle that she had not yet had occasion to use in his presence. She checked it with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, worked the lever to confirm a round was chambered, and walked to the door. "Lucy," he said. She turned. "Let me handle this," he said. Not an order, not even a request exactly, more like an offering. She considered him for a moment. "We handle it together," she said. "I am not going to stand behind you on my own porch while men come to take my land." "No," he said. "You are absolutely right, together." He paused. "But if it comes to shooting, I need you to trust me. My hand is not what it was, but it is better than it was 3 weeks ago, and I know what I am doing in a situation like this." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her assessing him the way she assessed everything, carefully and completely and without sentimentality. "Your morning accuracy with the bottles has improved 40% since we started treatment," she said. "Your fine motor control is not yet fully restored, but your gross motor control, which is what matters at practical pistol range, has recovered substantially." She paused. "You know that because you have been feeling it." "I know it because I have been measuring it." "Yes," he said. "I trust you," she said, and it was 3 words that weighed more than any 3 words he had heard in a very long time. They went out onto the porch together. Rudder pulled his horse up at the fence and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who was running out of patience and had decided to let that show. "Boone," he said, "this has gone on long enough. The Syndicate is done negotiating." "Miss Dawson is not negotiating with the Syndicate," Amos said. "She is not selling this land. She has made that clear repeatedly. There is nothing further to discuss." "There is something further to discuss," Rudder said, and his hand moved toward the inside of his coat, and Amos felt the situation shift into the particular register that he knew better than almost any other. The suspended moment before action where every calculation runs simultaneously, and the outcome depends on who has done the better work beforehand. What happened next happened with a speed that made it difficult to reconstruct afterward, though both Amos and Lucy could account for every second of it with perfect clarity. Rudder's hand came out of his coat, and it was not holding a gun. It was holding a document, which he pitched forward onto the fence rail with the theatrical gesture of a man who had decided to try one more legal gambit before the other kind. "Signed deed," he said. "Notarized and filed in Tucson 3 days ago. This land legally belongs to the Barlow Syndicate." Cross and his men spread out slightly to either side as Rudder spoke, a practiced tactical movement, and Amos felt Lucy shift beside him. "That document," Lucy said, clearly and evenly, "was filed using the same forged witness signature that appeared on the document your legal representative attempted to serve us with 9 days ago. The man in the suit came back 2 days ago to tell us He had verified the forgery independently and withdrawn from the Syndicate's employment. He was kind enough to leave a copy of his findings with me. She reached into the pocket of her canvas trousers and produced a folded paper, which she held up. I have the documentation. I also have, as of this morning, a telegram from the territorial governor's office acknowledging receipt of my evidence package and informing me that a federal investigation into Barlow Syndicate land practices has been opened. She paused. You are welcome to verify the telegram. I have the original inside. The silence after this was a different kind of silence from the one that had followed her encounter with the lawyer. This one was the silence of a calculation collapsing. Cross looked at Rudder. The 6 men behind them looked at each other. Rudder's face was doing things that Amos watched with the professional interest of a man who understood the expressions that preceded violence and was measuring whether this was going to be one of those moments. It was Cross who made the decision. He turned his horse. "This is done," he said to Rudder, in a flat voice that contained no room for argument. "If there is a federal investigation open, anything we do here today becomes evidence." "Walk away, Rudder." Rudder's face cycled through rage and calculation and the particular kind of shame that comes from being outmaneuvered by someone you had underestimated. He looked at Lucy Dawson for a long moment, and then he looked at Amos, and then he straightened in his saddle and said with the empty dignity of a defeated man, "This is not over." "Yes," Lucy said pleasantly. "It is." They rode away, all 8 of them, Rudder last, without another word. Amos stood on the porch for a moment after they were out of sight, and then he became aware that his right hand was completely still. He lifted it and looked at it, and it was not shaking, not even slightly. "Lucy," he said. She was already looking at him. "I know," she said. "I saw." He turned to face her fully, and whatever was on his face, she read it with the completeness she brought to everything. And what came back from her in the way she looked at him, and the way her expression had finally, fully opened, was enough to resolve every question he had been carrying since the first day he had ridden up to this property, and watched her stand still in the center of a corral, while a frightened horse decided to trust her. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right." "Not out here," he said. "Inside." They went inside, and he sat across from her at the table where she had treated his hand every morning for 7 weeks, and he said, "I would like to stay here. Not as your deterrent and not because of my hand, though I am grateful for both of those things beyond my ability to express it. I would like to stay because this place feels more like a home than anywhere I have been in my adult life, and because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because I realize I have spent 7 weeks falling in love with you, and it would be dishonest to continue without acknowledging that." Lucy Dawson looked at him. The morning light was coming through the front window and falling across the table between them, and she was sitting very still in the way she did when she was thinking something through completely before she spoke. "The people I let close to me tend to leave," she said. "Either by choice or by circumstance or by dying of fever when I was 9 years old, or by getting on a horse and riding off to map the next piece of territory regardless of how much I might have wanted them to stay." She paused. "I know what it looks like when a man has a restless nature. I have been very careful not to confuse how I feel about you with a reliable prediction of your behavior." "That is fair," he said. "And I cannot give you certainty about the future, because no one can. But I can tell you that restlessness feels different when there is a place you actually want to be. I have not had that before, and I did not know the difference until now." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said, "I have been telling myself for 6 weeks that what I feel about you is a function of the circumstances. That it is the product of mutual dependence in a high-stakes situation and will evaporate when the stakes lower." "Has it evaporated?" he asked. "No," she said. "It has done the opposite of evaporating." He reached across the table, and he took her hand in his, the right hand that she had worked on every morning for 7 weeks, and that was, at this moment, completely and entirely still. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and what he saw in her face was not the clinical, assessing attention of the physician, though that was always present somewhere underneath. It was something different, something that had been building behind her composure for weeks and was now, finally, not being managed back to neutral. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said, to whatever she was about to say and to everything she had not yet said. She turned her hand over and held his, and the grip was steady and warm and completely certain. And when she leaned across the small table and kissed him, it was with the same quality she brought to everything, deliberate and focused, and without any doubt at all about what she meant by it. The federal investigation that Lucy had set in motion did not resolve itself quickly. These things never did in 1878, in a territory where the federal presence was thin and the legal machinery was slow, and the Barlow Syndicate had spent years cultivating relationships in the territorial administration that now needed to be carefully and systematically disentangled. But it resolved. Over the following 5 months, with evidence that Lucy had assembled over 2 years, and that the federal investigators supplemented with their own findings, the syndicate's land acquisition practices were exposed in the territorial papers, in the Phoenix Daily, and eventually in a national publication that covered Western land policy. 3 of the syndicate's principals were indicted on fraud charges. The fraudulent deed filings were voided by the territorial court. The land commissioner who had accepted bribes resigned. Cole Rutter left the territory in November, quietly, which was what men like Rutter did when the ground shifted under them. Shelby Cross, who was a professional and had been a professional all along, sent Amos a brief note that said simply that he bore no personal animosity and that he had found different employment, which Amos received as the closest thing to an apology that Cross was capable of producing, and accepted it in that spirit. The town of Redemption Creek had, over the 5 months of all of this, undergone its own small shifts. The story had broken in October, and people who had quietly accepted Lucy Dawson's medical practice for 2 years, while publicly pretending it did not exist, had begun to openly acknowledge what they had always privately known, which was that she was the best medical practitioner within a day's ride and probably considerably further. The Reverend's wife, who was also the most socially influential person in town outside of the bank and the mayor, came out to the Dawson place in November to talk to Lucy about the possibility of the town formalizing the medical practice, which meant funding it with a small quarterly contribution from the town council in exchange for Lucy agreeing to a regular clinic day in town twice a month. Lucy considered the offer for 2 days and then accepted it, on the condition that the practice remained hers to run as she saw fit, and that the town council did not get a vote on medical decisions. The Reverend's wife agreed to this without hesitation, because the Reverend's wife had 3 children and had had occasion to use Lucy's services twice, and had a very clear sense of what she was buying. Old Dr. Whitmore, when he heard about it, stopped by the Dawson place himself, which surprised everyone, and had a long conversation with Lucy that Amos was not present for. When he left, his expression was something between relief and professional dignity reasserting itself, and Lucy told Amos afterward that he had offered to formally refer patients to her, which was more than she had expected, and which she had accepted gracefully because it was the right thing to do and because Whitmore, whatever his other failings, had clearly done some honest self-assessment, and she respected that. Amos, during all of this, had been working, not with his gun, or not primarily. He had been working the land itself, which needed more attention than one person could give it, and he found to his surprise that he was good at this, or at least that he was willing to be bad at it first and learn, which was the prerequisite for getting good at anything. He repaired the corral fence. He extended the kitchen garden. He spent 2 weeks engineering an improvement to the rain catchment system that doubled its capacity, working from a principle of water management that Lucy had explained to him, with the same thoroughness she applied to explaining nerve function, and which he had understood immediately because it turned out that thinking clearly about spatial problems was a skill he had, and had simply never applied to anything that stayed in one place before. He also, on a cold morning in December, rode into Redemption Creek and spent 30 minutes in conversation with the Reverend Thomas Carr, who was a practical man of God and who had been watching the situation at the Dawson place develop with the interested attention of a man who was waiting for people to figure out what was already obvious to anyone paying attention. Amos did not say very much. He stated his situation and his intentions clearly and asked a single question. The Reverend answered the question with a yes and a handshake. He rode back to the homestead and found Lucy in the small building to the east, the one with the chimney and the glass window which she used as her dispensary and private laboratory, bent over something she was preparing on her work table. She did not look up when he came in. "How is General?" she asked, because he had mentioned that morning that the horse had seemed off and she had been thinking about it. "Fine," he said. "I think he was just cold, same as the rest of us." She made a sound of agreement and continued what she was doing. The room smelled of dried herbs and something sharp and chemical that he had learned to identify as the specific preparation she used for wound cleaning, which she had improved on the standard carbolic acid protocol with modifications she had worked out over 18 months of consistent observation and documentation. "Lucy," he said. She said, still not looking up, because whatever she was measuring required precision. "I spoke with Reverend Carr this morning," he said. She stopped. Her hands were still for a moment above the work table. Then she turned around and looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and all of her particular quality of focused attention was directed at him. "Did you?" she said. "I did," he said. "I want to be married to you. I'm asking if you want to be married to me, which are two separate questions, and I understand that, and I am trying to ask the second one rather than assume the answer to it." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the December wind was moving through the dry sage, and the afternoon light was thin and pale and golden on the red rock of the hills to the north. "The answer to the second question," she said carefully, "requires me to say something that I want to say correctly." "Take all the time you need," he said. "I have thought about marriage," she said. "I thought about it when I was in Philadelphia, and what I thought was that marriage, as it was generally constituted in this time and in this society, required women to make themselves smaller. Not always and not in every marriage, but consistently enough that it seemed like a reasonable risk to avoid. I came out here specifically to avoid having to make myself smaller." She paused. "What I have found in the past months is that you are, in my direct experience, a man who does not require that. Not only do you not require it, you seem to be most comfortable and most fully yourself when I am operating at my full capacity. That is an extraordinary thing. It is rarer than a good aquifer." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and his voice did not entirely succeed at the steady quality he was aiming for. "It is a yes," she said, "with one condition." "Name it," he said. "The condition is that we remain honest with each other in the way we have been honest," she said. "Which I know sounds obvious, but I want it named because it is the thing I value most about what we have built here, and I want it to be intentional rather than accidental." "You have my word," he said. "And my word is a thing I take seriously." "I know that," she said. "It is one of the things I am marrying." He crossed the small room and he held her face in both of his hands, the right hand that she had healed and the left hand that had never needed healing. And he kissed her with the certainty of a man who has found the one place in the world where he is entirely in the right location. They were married on a Saturday in January of 1879, in the Redemption Creek Church, in front of approximately 40 people who represented a cross-section of the community that Lucy had been serving for 2 years, and that had, over the past months, come to understand more fully what it had in her. The Reverend's wife had organized the whole thing with characteristic efficiency once given the go-ahead, and the result was a wedding that had the direct, unpretentious quality of both of its principles: honest, warm, and done correctly without being theatrical about it. Lucy wore a dress that she had made herself over 3 evenings, a practical but beautiful gray-blue wool that matched her eyes when the light hit them a certain way. And she wore her hair down for the first time in Amos's experience of her. And the effect of this was such that Amos, standing at the front of the church watching her walk down the aisle toward him, lost his composure completely for approximately 10 seconds before recovering it, which was noted with satisfaction by the Reverend's wife, and with a quiet, certain smile by Lucy herself. They came back to the homestead that evening as husband and wife, and the homestead, which had always been hers, became something new without becoming less what it was, because that was the nature of an addition that fits. The spring of 1879 was the best growing season the territory had seen in 3 years. They expanded the kitchen garden, added a proper chicken house, and Amos built a second rain catchment on the north side of the property that Lucy had sketched out the design for on paper one evening, while they were talking about the summer water situation, and which worked even better than the first. 3 new families had moved into the area north of Redemption Creek, drawn partly by the availability of medical care, and Lucy's twice-monthly clinic in town had become a genuine institution, filling the gap left by Dr. Whitmore's retirement in March. Amos had work of a different kind now. He had his name still, and his reputation, which he had redirected deliberately into something more constructive, taking on work as a deputy for the county sheriff on a part-time basis, because the sheriff needed someone who could be trusted to ride out to difficult situations and de-escalate them without necessarily shooting anyone, which turned out to be a specialty that Amos was well positioned to develop. His hand was, by spring, 90% of what it had been before New Mexico, which Lucy told him with characteristic precision was the expected outcome, and which was, in practical terms, better than adequate for everything he needed it for. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the desert go through its colors, from gold to red to purple, to the deep velvet blue of true dark with the stars coming in, and they talked with the ease of 2 people who have found in each other the particular combination of understanding and honest challenge that makes conversation perpetually interesting regardless of the subject. They were different people in many ways, formed by different experiences and shaped by different kinds of intelligence, and the difference was not friction but fuel, the way 2 rivers joining creates something larger than either one was alone. In June, Lucy told him, with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely her own, that she was going to have a child. She had known for 2 weeks and had waited until she was certain of her own assessment before telling him, which he accepted as completely consistent with who she was and which made him love her more rather than less. He asked how she felt. She told him she felt well, described the specific physiological changes she was observing with the precision of a physician conducting a case study on herself, and then said, in a slightly different tone that was the tone she used when she was allowing something through the professional composure, that she was happy and a little frightened and very glad he was here. He held her in the evening light on the porch and did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing to say that was more precise than the silence between them. Their son was born in February of 1880, on a cold night when the wind was coming hard off the high desert and the fire in the hearth was burning well. Lucy, who had delivered more babies than she could count at this point, had strong opinions about how this was to be done, and communicated them clearly throughout the process to the midwife, Mrs. Alvarez, who had delivered most of the babies in the territory for the past 20 years, and who had her own strong opinions, and who managed to integrate both sets of opinions into a process that was orderly and effective and resulted, before midnight, in a son. They named him Daniel, after Lucy's father, with the middle name Thomas, after the Reverend who had answered a single question with a yes and a handshake on a cold December morning. Daniel was small and loud, and had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's stubbornness, which Lucy observed within the first week with the same precise attention she brought to all her observations, and which Amos received with a kind of helpless, overwhelming pride that he had not anticipated, and which seemed to have bypassed every defense he had ever constructed and gone directly to wherever he was most essentially himself. In the months that followed Daniel's birth, the homestead expanded again, necessarily and organically. A second room off the main building, a larger dispensary. Amos fenced another section of land to the north for a proper pasture, because the horses needed more space, and because having a proper pasture was the kind of thing that you did when you were staying somewhere permanently and had stopped needing to think about whether you were staying. Redemption Creek itself was growing. The federal investigation of the Barlow Syndicate had, as Lucy had predicted, changed the landscape of the territory's development, opening up land that had been held or threatened by the Syndicate, and allowing families to establish holdings that would have been impossible or impossibly precarious before. New families meant a larger school, which meant the schoolteacher got an assistant. It meant a second church and a telegraph office. It meant the social fabric thickening from the thin, stretched thing it had been toward something more substantial and more capable of holding people's weight. Lucy's practice grew with the town. She took on a young woman in 1881, Sarah Keene, who had come west from Ohio with medical training and no place to apply it, and Lucy mentored her with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, passing on not just knowledge but approach, the habit of looking carefully and reading the evidence rather than the assumption, the commitment to documenting what you found, the understanding that a patient's trust was the most important tool in the room. Amos, watching Lucy teach, saw in her teaching the same quality that had drawn him across the corral fence and into her kitchen and into her life, the absolute, unperforming confidence of a person who knows precisely what they know and is glad to give it away because knowledge does not diminish when shared. He had been learning things himself. Not medicine, though he had absorbed more medical knowledge than most frontier men simply through proximity, through years of morning treatment sessions and evening conversations, and the specific education that comes from living with someone whose mind operates the way Lucy's mind operated. He had been learning about the land, about water management, about the kind of patient, long-thinking engagement with a place that his previous life had never required of him. He had been learning about what it meant to have a community that you were part of rather than passing through. He had been learning, most essentially, what it felt like to be known and to allow it. His reputation continued to protect them, not through violence but through its presence, the way a good fence protects a garden, not by fighting anything but simply by being there. There were incidents. There were always incidents in the Arizona territory in that period. But the combination of Amos's name and his genuine competence, and his visible commitment to this specific piece of land, and these specific people created a situation in which the calculation for anyone considering an aggressive move came out wrong more often than not. He was not a violent man now. He had been, or had been in a context that required it, and those years were part of him in ways that did not dissolve. But he had found, as Lucy had found years before in her own context, that the skills developed in one kind of life could be translated into another kind if you were willing to do the work of translation, rather than simply repeating the patterns that no longer served. In 1882, Lucy completed a research paper based on 2 years of consistent documentation of nerve injury and recovery cases in the territory, which included, anonymously, the case of a gunfighter whose hand had been damaged by a barn collapse, and which described in detail the treatment protocol she had developed and its outcomes. She sent it to 2 medical journals. One rejected it without explanation. One published it after a 6-month review process, making it one of the first papers on peripheral nerve recovery authored by a woman to appear in an American medical journal. Amos read it 3 times. He did not have the technical language for much of it, but he understood the structure, which was the structure of all her thinking: careful observation, rigorous documentation, honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, conclusions held only to the degree supported by evidence. He understood that the anonymous case in the paper was his case, that she had been documenting his recovery with scientific precision for the entire time she had been treating him, and that his hand and its healing had contributed, in a small but genuine way, to medical knowledge that would help people he would never meet. He told her it was the finest thing he had ever read. She told him he was biased. He told her that bias and accuracy were not mutually exclusive. She laughed, which was one of the best sounds he had heard in his life, and she was still laughing when Daniel, who was 2 years old and deeply suspicious of anything that excluded him, came barreling in from the back room to find out what was happening, and Amos caught him and swung him up, and the laughter continued for everyone. By 1883, they had been married 4 years, and the homestead was a different place from the property Amos had first ridden up to on a roan horse with a trembling hand, and a moral position he had not yet decided on. It was a full, working place now, with the expanded house and the well-established garden and the proper pasture, and the dispensary that saw patients 3 days a week, and the small library that had grown from Lucy's original shelves to take up an entire wall of the new sitting room they had added the previous year. Daniel was 3, and conducting his own ongoing investigation of everything within reach, which Lucy supervised with patient attention, and Amos, abetted with the specific enthusiasm of a father who found his son's fearlessness entirely relatable. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn persistence, and both parents' tendency to examine things thoroughly before drawing conclusions, which Lucy said was either nature or nurture, or more probably both. And in March of that year, Lucy told him there would be a second child. This one, born in October, was a girl. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but in the way that some names simply belong to the person they are given to from the moment they are chosen. Clara was quieter than Daniel had been as an infant, watchful in a way that made Amos laugh when he recognized it, because she had her mother's quality of focused attention from the very beginning, those serious gray-green eyes tracking movement with the careful concentration of someone who was already collecting data. He told Lucy this, watching Clara one evening. Lucy, who was exhausted in the particular way of new mothers and was also, as always, completely present, looked at her daughter and then at her husband and said, "Of course she does. She is ours." The years moved in the way that good years move, not slowly and not quickly, but with the particular quality of time that is fully inhabited, where each day has enough in it to be worth remembering, and the accumulation of days becomes a life that you can look back at with the recognition that you were where you were supposed to be while you were there. In 1884, the county formally offered Amos the position of county sheriff, which had been vacant since the previous sheriff retired. He thought about it for several days, which meant he discussed it with Lucy every evening for several days, which was how he did his best thinking now, had been for years. She did not tell him what to decide. She asked questions, the right questions, in the way she always did, that helped him understand what he actually wanted as distinguished from what he thought he should want or what habit suggested. What he wanted was to be useful in a way that did not require him to be primarily a threat. What he wanted was to be present for his children. What he wanted was to keep doing the work on this land that was theirs now in every sense, the legal sense and the practical sense, and the deeper sense of having put enough of yourself into a place that it holds your shape. He turned down the sheriff's position and took instead the role of deputy, part-time, with the specific brief of mediation and de-escalation in the expanding northern part of the county. It was good work. It fit him. The land that Lucy had refused to sell remained hers, theirs now, above the aquifer that her father had known about and that she had protected, and that served, by 1885, the water needs of more than 300 families in 2 territories. The Barlow Syndicate had dissolved under the weight of the federal case and its principal's indictments. The land was safe in the way that anything carefully protected and legally documented and publicly known can be said to be safe, which is not absolutely but is substantially, and substantially was enough. On an evening in the fall of 1885, Amos and Lucy sat on the porch of the homestead that they had made together, in the cooling air that came down off the desert at the end of a hot day, and watched Daniel, who was 5, chase the chickens in the front yard with the single-minded determination of a boy who was not going to learn the lesson about chickens the easy way. Clara, who was 2, sat in Lucy's lap and watched her brother with the focused attention that was already her most characteristic feature, her small face serious and interested. The sky was doing its evening work, running through the spectrum from blue to gold to the deep burnt orange that this particular piece of desert produced better than any other sky Amos had ever seen, and the Ocotillo on the ridge to the north were silhouettes against it, the way they always were, the way they had been on the first evening he had sat here. He looked at his right hand, resting on his knee, completely still. He thought about the man who had ridden up this road 4 years ago with a trembling hand and a borrowed purpose, and a life that was pulling in opposite directions. He thought about the bottle he had shot at and missed on the day Rudder had given him this assignment that had turned out not to be what he had accepted it as, but had turned out instead to be the last job he needed, and the first thing he had ever done that led directly and without detour to the place he was supposed to be. Lucy looked at him. She could always tell when he was thinking something that had weight to it. She had been reading him for 4 years with the same attention she gave everything, and she was very good at it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the first day," he said, "about riding up here with my hands shaking and not knowing what I was going to do." "I knew," she said. He looked at her. "You did not." "I had a strong suspicion," she amended. "You arrived telling me the truth, which was not what Rudder sent you for. That told me a significant amount about who you were." She looked back at the ridge, the Ocotillo against the burning sky. "I ran a calculation." "What kind of calculation?" he asked. "The kind where the evidence suggests a result, and you decide to act on the result even though the evidence is not yet complete," she said. "In medicine, we call it clinical judgment. Outside of medicine, I believe people call it hope." He reached over and took her hand, around Clara's small warm weight between them, and held it in his right hand that no longer shook, that she had steadied with her own calm and her own knowledge and her own stubborn, extraordinary determination to be fully what she was in a world that had not always made room for it. She squeezed his hand. Daniel had cornered a chicken against the fence and was looking at it with an expression of triumphant surprise, as if the actual catching had not been part of the plan and he was now improvising. The chicken, with great dignity, walked around him and rejoined the flock. Daniel stood for a moment looking at the space where the chicken had been, and then he turned around and grinned at his parents with the specific, illuminating grin of a child who finds the world deeply interesting rather than deeply disappointing. Clara laughed, a small bright sound in the evening air. Amos Boone looked at his family on the porch of the home that had been made from one woman's stubbornness and one man's decision to be honest at a moment when lying would have been easier, and felt the thing in his chest that he had stopped trying to identify because he knew what it was now and had known for years, and it had not diminished with knowing, but had only grown more solid and more sure. "I love you," he said to Lucy simply, because it was the truest thing he could say in the language he had. She turned to look at him with those gray-green eyes, and what was in them was everything she was: the physician's precision and the scientist's rigor and the stubborn, principled, clear-eyed woman who had stood on her own porch and refused to be moved, and the person who had held his broken hand every morning until it healed, and the wife who had built a life alongside him with the same systematic care she brought to everything, and the mother who was watching their son discover the limits of chicken pursuit in the last light of a desert evening. "I love you," she said, and she meant it with everything she had. The stars came in over the Arizona territory, over the land that was theirs and the house they had made, and the children learning to become themselves in the space that two people had cleared for them. And the night came down around all of it, warm and wide and full. The way good endings are always full, which is to say full of everything that brought them there and everything that comes next.